Hello, listeners, and welcome back to part two of the episode series Reality is So Unreal, where we are going to look into stress with special focus on caregiver stress. So, for the part two, we are going to look into how societies have approached caregiving in the past versus the present approach. So, as we reflect on historical perspectives on caregiving, it's evident that the landscape has changed significantly. In earlier times, caregiving was often viewed as a family duty, and it was mainly shouldered by women. With very little acknowledgement or support from society, they used to manage this role, or the expectation was that women will manage these roles. Caregivers were typically expected to be self sacrificing, prioritizing the needs of their loved ones above their own, and often at the expense of their own well being. Now, this societal norm created an environment where stress was not just common, it was often expected, but never identified as stress. And many caregivers suffered in silence, lacking the resources or outlets to express their strengths and struggles. Well, take for instance, in the Victorian era, caregiving during this time was largely considered, which I said, a women's responsibility with societal ideals, framing these caregivers as angels in the house, selfless, nurturing, and always available. While this notion may have given some caregivers a sense of purpose, it imposed unrealistic expectations that contributed to emotional and physical exhaustion. Social psychologists like Susan Collins have noted that such ideals can create internal conflicts for caregivers, leading them to suppress their own needs and feelings, which can exacerbate stress and lead to burnout. Now, let's fast forward this to the present society, where we can see both progress and ongoing challenges. In modern society, it has been started to recognize that the complexities of caregiving, with an increasing emphasis on mental health, self care, and importance of support systems. Caregivers today are encouraged to seek help and prioritize their well being. However, they still grapple with societal pressures to manage everything flawlessly, which can lead to significant stress. So, what are we communicating here? Is it that caregiver stress can lead to negative impact on the person that are providing the care, or that caregiver stress is not evident, or is there not enough evidence to support that they do grapple? In many cultures today, caregivers are expected to juggle multiple responsibilities: work, family, and caregiving duties without missing a beat. Now, be aware that in the Victorian era, not every women, or as I said, expected caregiver, worked, living in their own houses and doing house chores and attending to day house related activities, as we can call them. Whereas the change in this current society, where women and men contribute together towards societal gains by working, this change is a very crucial factor. This has given rise to phenomena of caregiver stress manifesting as burnout, anxiety, and even physical health issues, where caregivers are juggling between these tasks, which is work, family, and caregiving. The American Psychological Association highlights that many caregivers feel isolated and burned by the expectation to fulfill these roles perfectly, mirroring the pressures faced by caregivers in the past. So, in summary, while we have made strides in how we perceive caregiving, viewing it solely as an obligation to recognizing it as a role deserving support, there is still a complex web of societal expectations that can hinder caregivers' ability to thrive. There is a thing called caregivers' guilt. So, acknowledging these shifts is crucial, but it's equally important to recognize that caregivers today continue to navigate significant pressures, Often these are exacerbated by their very systems that are designed to support them or their internal conflicts. So, as we continue with this episode, I invite you listeners to reflect on these changes in caregiving practices and how they relate to your experiences of those that are around you. As we continue, let's explore some specific caregiving approaches from these continents of Europe and Asia and highlight the cultural nuances and practices which is very unique to each region. So let's start with Europe. Let's examine the Nordic model, which is prevalent in countries like Sweden, Norway, and Denmark. Now, here, caregiving is regarded as a collective responsibility, which is supported by a very comprehensive welfare system. Governments offer various resources, including financial assistance and training programs, which enable families to balance caregiving with their own lives. For instance, in Sweden, family caregivers can receive a monthly allowance to elevate the financial burden associated with caring for a loved one. This system not only acknowledges that the crucial role of caregivers is essential, but also helps to diminish the stigma surrounding caregiving. In contrast, let's consider the historical approach to caregiving in UK, where traditionally caregiving was less formalized, often seen as an inherent family obligation. However, the Carers Recognition and Services Act marks a significant shift, acknowledging the vital role caregivers play. This was the key shift, this act, where this act ensured that caregivers will have access to support services and training, allowing them to request assessments to identify their own needs. This evolution from a familial duty to a societal responsibility highlights a growing recognition of the stress caregivers face. Now let's travel to Asia, where caregiving practices can vary very significantly. For example, in Japan, the community based integrated care system emphasizes collaboration among families, healthcare providers, and local governments. Now, this approach facilitates that the elderly individual remain at their homes while receiving necessary support. The Japanese government provides resources for family caregivers such as training and respite services, reflecting an understanding that caregiving extends beyond individual families to encompass the community. And this modern perspective is very much in contrast sharply with the traditional practices, where caregiving was primarily seen as a family duty, often resulting in overwhelming stress. In China, this deep rooted value underscores the importance of caring for one's parents and elders as a fundamental society expectation. While many still adhere to their tradition, urbanization has led to a development of community support services for caregivers, now which is very quite evident in these modern times. The current government initiatives often are seen to assist families and signaling a shift towards a more balanced approach to caregiving responsibilities. There's a lot of research papers that support this. Now, finally, India, where the joint family system has traditionally provided a robust support network for caregivers, allowing family members to share responsibilities and alleviate some stress. However, India is seeing a lot of modernization and a shift. And the trend towards nuclear families is very evident, looking at the societal pressures. So, the need for formal caregiving services is increasingly recognized. There are evident examples of emergence of senior care facilities which highlight this shift and offer alternative support for families that can no longer shoulder caregiving alone. So, listeners, as we conclude this part 2, we can see that caregiving approaches differ significantly across cultures and time periods. The shift in environment has a lot to do with this. While many societies are beginning to acknowledge the challenges faced by caregiving, the journey towards a supportive framework is an ongoing process. But understanding these diverse approaches can provide a very valuable insight into how we can understand that there is a crucial factor, a variable there, which is caregivers' stress or burnout, and support caregivers in our community today. So stay tuned for the next segment where we will delve deep into theories that look into caregiver stress. Thank you for joining me on Let's Talk and Learn. Until next time, take care of yourself and be kind.